I want to start by thanking you for having me here today, particularly Reverend Leslie for the invitation, and I have to say for those of you who have been part of my journey in Unitarian Universalism. I came to MDUUC in, I believe, 2010 or thereabouts, and it felt like home. I was part of MDUUC before I even started working for the UU Justice Ministry, then the Legislative Ministry, and I just want to thank you for giving me that home. I also want to take a moment and particularly thank a couple people in this congregation that offer exceptional leadership within UUJM. Elizabeth Copley, who has served as an ambassador for a number of years, and Bob Lane and Mary Finlan, who serve ably in leadership of our Economic Justice Action Team. I just want to acknowledge them, and I think Bob is here for this service, so thank you. Now, last October, I was reflecting on St. Francis of Assisi. As you may know, St. Francis is revered not only by those of the Catholic faith, but many who value him as the patron saint of animals and ecology. Now, I know many in our community may have issues with the Catholic Church, and I'm just going to ask you to bear with me here because there's a larger frame to consider. St. Francis, I learned, had a reverence for nature like no other. A reverence that left his followers and those with whom he came in contact in awe. His reverence for God's creation was so great, it spawned stories. Stories that helped pave the way for his eventual sainthood. Like the time he negotiated a truce between a wolf that terrorized the residents of a town and the leadership of that town. And the time he came across a field of birds and he preached to them. The story went that not one of the birds left until he was finished, which is pretty impressive if you ask me. Now that was a while ago. Let us fast forward about 800 years. Let's move from a time when the world population was somewhere between 350 and 450 million, depending on what book you look at, to modern times, when we have over 7 billion people. Let's zip past the many clashes of culture, past the colonization of continents, past the slave trade, past wars that used entire civilizations as pawns in elaborate political and economic battles. Past Columbus and the colonization of the U.S., let's zip through the creation of entire societies founded on wars of extermination and economies of slavery, followed by segregation and systemic oppression. Let's fast forward to today. Today, I do not think a religious appreciation for God's creation would garner anyone's sainthood, or quite frankly, even a mention in a newsletter. In fact, preaching to birds would probably not garner you the support you need to make a dent in the issues that have accumulated in the past 800 or 900 years. And while in the past many arguments arose as to when the tipping point of our environmental crisis would occur, in a few thousand years, a few hundred years, or in our lifetimes, we now know that the tipping point has already passed. And a crisis is alive and happening every day. Modern times require more action than that of sainthood. Today we live in a country where millions are impacted every day by climate change, water shortages, and race-based land use planning. And for just a moment, I want you to consider what many people think of when they hear phrases like global warming or climate change. I, for one, think of glaciers melting. I think of fluffy seals or polar bears going extinct. I think of when our cities will be hit. How many people will be displaced? Where will they go? Will it lead to war? I think of the calendar I get in the mail from a charity I donated to long ago. The one with the same fluffy seal as the picture for March, and a beautiful sunset over a glacier on the page for December. I think of a newspaper article that I read about an elected official debating the legitimacy of whether this crisis was caused by humans, as if that matters one bit. And then I pause. I pause and I realize that 2 of the top 10 zip codes for childhood admissions to hospitals for asthma are in Oakland and Emeryville. I pause and I realize that wars based on infertile land and lack of water are already going on. I pause and I remember that First Peoples, such as the Winnemem-Wintu tribe in nearby Shasta Lake, are already in great threat due to our water issues and are being forced from their land. The list goes on, and it is seen across the country. Now, in 1979, after residents in communities of Houston, Texas, began having widespread medical problems, sociologist Robert Bullard looked into the siting of toxic landfills. He found that all 5 of Houston's city-owned garbage dumps, 6 of 8 city-owned garbage incinerators, and 3 of the 4 privately owned landfills were all sited in African American neighborhoods, even though African Americans at the time only comprised 25% of the population. During the 1980s, Robert Bullard expanded his study of environmental racism, and in his book, Dumping in Dixie, which I highly recommend, he reported similar disturbing and universal findings across the entire South. And I'm glad that the crisis in Flint, Michigan is getting the attention it deserves so well. And at the same time, I know that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of Flint, Michigans in this country. There are still over 1 million Californians who are doing without safe, clean, affordable water as we struggle with big ag interests to implement the Human Right to Water Act. You see, environmental justice is only abstract if we let it be so. Only if we are content to plug our ears and shut our eyes. Only if we pretend this is a long-term problem. Only if we believe that we can solve this by talking amongst ourselves, merely recycling, driving a hybrid, or picking up trash when we see it. I know I give myself mental points when I do those things. And these are good actions, but alone they will not solve the problem we are facing. Dr. King, in his Ware lecture to the 1966 Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, said, "We are challenged to instill within the people of our congregations a world perspective. The world in which we live is geographically one. Now, more and more, we are challenged to make it one in terms of brotherhood. Modern man, through his scientific genius, has been able to dwarf distance and place time in chains. Through our scientific genius, we have made of this world a neighborhood. And now, through our moral and ethical commitment, we must make it a brotherhood. We must live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. This is a fact of life. No individual can live alone. No nation can live alone." I would certainly hope and expect that if given today, the words would be more inclusive of the roles of those who identify as other than men. But the point remains the same. As Unitarian Universalists, we have a worldview that incorporates respect for the interdependent web of all existence, acknowledgement of the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, and have a goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. In fact, as UUs, while we may lack the vision of an afterlife that St. Francis had, we have something more powerful. What we have is here. Our version of heaven is under our feet and around us. Of course, that means we have to make of it what we can. I personally don't know of many streets paved with gold, and there are not pearly gates around many of our communities. But we still have something many faiths do not: a heaven on earth. We just have to live into those principles to which we aspire. So how do we do this? Both practically and because we believe in an interdependent web. We begin together, not just as UUs, but as UUs connected to a wider society. Not to help others, but again, in pursuit of a beloved community based on love, respect, and interdependence. Lila Watson, an Aboriginal leader, once said, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. If you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." When we recognize that those directly impacted by environmental injustice are the experts, and that we can join with them and be part of the solution built on collaboration and respect, we can make things happen. For many of us, because of our various forms of privilege, this can be challenging. As I've heard said, when it comes to UUs, where two or more are gathered, there are at least 3 opinions on the matter. And we must let go of our own sense of perfection in strategy, perfection in approach, and perfection in language. Instead, we must show up and listen. Show up and listen. Show up and listen. And then together we can act. Dr. King said, "One of the great misfortunes of history is that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in a great period of change and yet fail to achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands. There's nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution, and there can be no gainsaying of the fact that a revolution is taking place in our world today. When we move from saving fluffy seals in the abstract to lifting up the voices of impacted communities and working in coalition, we can build beloved community and create the people power necessary to form huge shifts in society, to make meaningful, long-lasting differences. And we will make mistakes. Relationships are messy. And with all the relationship building necessary to build a worldwide beloved community, our own version of heaven on earth, we can expect a lot of mess. Can I get an amen to that? Amen. But we must own our own faults when they trip us up. We must keep seeking to work toward beloved community. The price of failure is simply too high. Now, locally, both the UU Justice Ministry of California and the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County are involved in a project entitled Building Water Resiliency in Vulnerable and Underserved Communities in Contra Costa County. Earlier I was asked, and I can assure you that a UU did not name that project. But this project, sponsored by the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water, aims to empower local organizations and leaders to educate communities and create resiliency among our neighbors. I know Reverend Leslie and Reverend Sammons have been involved in this work as well, and I want to acknowledge and thank them for their striving to get this thing going. Additionally, The UU Justice Ministry is an active member of the Safe Water Alliance, and we are proud to work with members of the California Environmental Justice Alliance. These organizations are accountable to impacted communities and have proven effective in advocating for real, meaningful solutions. This year, we are pushing forward with implementation of the Human Right to Water Act, working to build resiliency in our communities, and put some meaningful reforms in place to really regulate the oil and gas industry. In fact, there is a package of 4 bills in the state legislature in response to the horrific ongoing gas leak in Southern California that has displaced thousands. Information on many of these items is available at the social justice table after the service, and I will be around afterwards as well to answer any questions. There will also be a way to sign up for more information about other ways to get involved locally. And there are sign-up forms if you're interested in more information on any of our programs around racial justice, environmental justice, economic justice, or immigrant justice, all of which have active volunteer-led action teams. Now, the specific challenges and opportunities will change from year to year, and yet they are all connected. At the same time, if we focus on building the relationships, on building beloved community, we can be a part of solutions not just now, but well into the future. And as we approach the work of turning back our environmental crisis, let us remember the words of Dr. King. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. We cannot wait. As the band reminded us earlier, the future started yesterday, and we are already late. So now, together and in faith, let us build the beloved community.